Thank you very much for these kind words of introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be invited to speak on this subject at this place. It's an honor to be asked to reconsider the subject of civil society, which it seems to me a quarter century after the revolutions of 1989, a quarter century after the end of the Soviet Union, is a subject which is worth reconsidering. One of the things which we now know is that civil society is not automatic. If anyone thought that history came to an end in 1989, or that liberalism and democracy were forces in themselves, there's been plenty of time to reconsider that opinion. It's simply not the case that history ends. It's simply not the case that liberalism and democracy are somehow self-sustaining forces which can maintain themselves against adversity automatically. There's nothing automatic in history. There's always the unexpected. There's always the initiative from the individual. And there are always these historical turning points when it makes sense to stop, to readjust, to recalibrate, to rethink. And I believe that we are at one of these historical turning points, and I appreciate your coming to think with me a bit for the next 45 minutes or so about what this historical turning point might be. So, as I said, I think this is an occasion to rethink civil society. The term civil society can become a slogan. It can become a stereotype. Nobody's really against civil society, right? And at the moment when something becomes a stereotype, when it becomes a phrase that we use without thinking, that's also precisely the moment to think about it. Because if civil society is to exist in a meaningful sense, it has to be something which is itself a bit unpredictable, a bit vivid, something which is authentic. And with that word authenticity, I want to recall the name Václav Havel. And this is one of the particular reasons why I'm so glad to be speaking about this subject today. As you will all know better than me, it was Havel's considerations in the 1970s which led many people in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and beyond, in my country as well, to think about what civil society might be. That there is some form of right, some form of activity, which is not reduced to the individual. That there is some form of rights, some form of activity that is not reduced to the state. That there's something between the individual and the state which is worth thinking about, which is worth considering, which has something to do with contacts between individuals, something to do with authentic individual choices. Now, all of that said, in practice, what does that really mean? And in practice, what does it mean in free societies now? And in practice, what does it mean when there are free societies confronted with a challenge from societies that are ever less free? That's our subject today. And for this subject, we have a case study. We have an extremely important, extremely urgent, and extremely interesting case study, which is the interaction between Russia and Ukraine in the last 15 or 16 months. That is the situation that has developed between Russia and Ukraine, inside Russia and inside Ukraine, roughly since October of 2013. Now, as you will all know, I'm speaking to you at a time of an active conventional war in Europe, right? So there are other things you could be thinking about besides coming to lectures in university, right? There's a war in Europe going on. The regular Russian army is engaging the regular Ukrainian army, not so very far from here. The largest tank battles since the Second World War have taken place in Europe. We're not paying that much attention to this, and one of our subjects is going to be why we don't pay that much attention to this. But what the point I'm trying to press home is that this is indeed a critical moment to be considering what civil society means. Which reminds me, one of the many things which is not automatic is memory. When civil society seemed to be triumphing in 1989, we had the impression, even as we thought that history ended, that we had hold of important historical turning points. That we all knew, for example, what 1938 meant, right? What Munich meant, right? What the Zdrada v Mnichově, what it meant. People had a sense that they thought they knew what 1938 meant, or 1939, or 1945, or 1968. It's my sense that one of the things that is slipping away from us is that confidence in historical knowledge. One of the things that is happening, or has happened in the last 25 years, as we've moved away from 1989, as we've embraced the toxic and foolish belief that history might come to an end, that democracy and liberalism might triumph automatically, that the market's all that matters, etc. As we've embraced these beliefs, one of the things that has slipped away from us is confidence about history. And I think the crisis that we're in now shows how important history actually is. And for these reasons, among many others, I was grateful for the kind words from my colleague, Professor Zubov, who was one of the people, in case you didn't know it, who recalled the significance of the year 1938 to a Russian and to a European public, which wasn't paying that much attention, and paid a certain human price for that. So with that said, I want to begin this consideration of the last year and a half by reviewing just a few crucial turning points in Russian and Ukrainian history, or in the common history that Russia and Ukraine are now debating, disputing, in some sense tragically fighting about. Because it seems to me that that history has to be something more, and I'll return to this at the end, that history has to be something more than a playing field in which everyone can say whatever they want, and the person is right, is the person who turns out to be right is the person who has the largest television network, right? History has to be something beyond that. History has to have some kind of integrity, some sort of rules. And in a way, I think this is another lesson this conflict has reminded us of. So the common Russian-Ukrainian history begins at around the same time and around the same way that Czech history begins, that all the Slavic histories begin. It begins with a competitive attempt by Eastern and Western Rite Christians to convert a pagan ruler. In the case of Kiev and Rus, which is one of the most very interesting entity, in the case of Kiev and Rus, in the 10th century, the entity in question was basically a synthesis of Vikings and Turkic peoples who had recently converted to Judaism. This is worth remembering. It's Vikings and Jews, and both the Ukrainians and the Russians say that it was them. So to keep it all in perspective, this is an odd myth of origin, just like, with apologies, your myth of origin is also very odd, and all of the myths of origin are very odd. The difference, of course, being that this idea of Volodymyr's conversion in 966, or Vladimir's conversion, if you happen to be Russian, is something that people are now fighting and dying for, right? So it's important precisely when people are fighting and dying, believing that what they're doing has something to do with 966, that we have some perspective and some distance on events like 966. Another turning point in Russian, I'm making this very telegraphic and very brief, but another turning point in Russian and Ukrainian history, if you like, would be the year 1569. Now, 1569 is not a turning point in Czech history, so let me just tell you why it's important. In 1569, a larger entity was established called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which included basically the territory of the Baltic states, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and a fair amount of Russia. I mentioned this symbolically just because it suggests a certain difference between Ukrainian and Russian history. Within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, cities like Chernihiv or Kiev experienced all of the stereotypical stages of European history. That is to say, there was a Renaissance, there was a Reformation, there was a Counter-Reformation. All of these things, of course, played out a bit differently in this Orthodox part of the world, but they all happened. And that is a difference between, let's say, Kiev and Moscow, right? We can't say Petersburg because it didn't exist, between Kiev and Moscow. And a difference which I think remains significant symbolically. The final date in my very brief trip through Ukrainian and Russian history, trying to establish what the differences and the similarities are, both in reality and in symbolism, would be the period between 1922 and 1923. The establishment of the Soviet Union through to the first 5-year plan. Now, the Soviet Union is obviously a big, important category which holds Russian and Ukrainian history together. Why? Because there has never been a Russian national state, right? Until 1991, there was no Russian national state. There was a Russian Empire. There was the Soviet Union. There has never been, with the exception of a few months here and there, there's never been a Ukrainian national state either, right? Ukraine and Russia throughout the 20th century experienced history in some important ways together inside the Soviet Union. So the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922 is an extremely important turning point. Within that memory of the Soviet Union, which is extremely important for both sides, there is a difference, and it's a difference which existed in 1991, as I had occasion to notice, and still exists today, and that is in the evaluation of Stalin's first 5-year plan. Now that may seem like a very abstract thing to mention. What is the first 5-year plan? Why can a 5-year plan possibly matter? Isn't state planning irrelevant? The first 5-year plan was the economic revolution inside the Soviet Union. It was Stalin's second revolution. It was the most important thing probably to happen in the Soviet Union, with the possible exception of the Second World War. It was, without a question, the most important internal Soviet policy. The idea was to transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian country into a modern industrial power. And in order to do this, agriculture, which was largely private in some parts of the country, was turned over to the state in the form of collective farms. As this happened, in general, the people who lived in more productive parts of the Soviet Union, southern Russia, Ukraine, suffered famine. And in particular, in the Ukrainian case, political measures were taken which ensured that this famine yielded several million more deaths than it had to. Now, that is a very important difference in memory, both in the sort of normal sense of transmission of memory down through the generations, as well as in political memory between Russia and Ukraine. Because essentially, all of the territories in today's Ukraine, except for the far west, experienced famine to some extent or another, where experiencing famine means someone in your family died, someone in your family committed cannibalism. If you survived, you might have committed cannibalism. You saw terrible things happen. The whole traditional village structure broke down. Everyone who survived ended up on a collective farm, right? So it was a massive transition in social mores, in social life. It was a massive humiliation, right, as well. And importantly for our subject, it was also the destruction of traditional civil society. Because think what you like of villages in the countryside, right? There is a certain set of norms which prevail in villages in the countryside. This was all destroyed, and it was replaced by something which actively opposed civil society in any form, okay? So the 1922 to 1933 is a difference in Russia and Ukraine, because in Russia, although I would emphasize this, there was a good deal of famine and starvation in Russia as well, it wasn't over the entire territory. So it doesn't form the central element of national memory in either senses of the word. Now, this brings us, in our very quick tour through Russian-Ukrainian history, to the current moment, where I'm going to be spending most of my time. But I want to stress something interesting about the current moment before I leave you behind. This history of the Soviet Union, as I said, in many ways binds Ukraine and Russia together, right? The history of the Second World War, in particular, the idea of the Second World War as a struggle between fascism and anti-fascism is something which actually binds most Ukrainians and most Russians together, or until very recently had done so. The Ukrainian history is a bit more complicated than Russian, but in general, for the vast majority of Ukrainian families, the memory of the Second World War is very similar than the Russian memory. And until very, very recently, this was something which held Russians and Ukrainians together. What has changed, and note this because this is interesting, what has changed is not that Ukrainians and Russians think about the Second World War differently now. What has changed is that the Second World War remains the only active reservoir of political memory in the Russian Federation, right? So everything that happens in the world today is still about fascism and anti-fascism, right? The bad guys are still the fascists. In Ukraine, what has happened is that new experiences have overlain and have overcome that traditional memory. So it's not as though people in Ukraine don't care about the Second World War anymore, right? What has happened, though, is the experience of the last 15 or 16 months of revolution, counter-revolution, and foreign invasion and a war of defense on their own territory has overwhelmed the memories of the Second World War. Or to put it very simply, something has happened, right? Something intense has happened, and that intense experience has pushed aside the memory of the Second World War and provided a different political myth for Ukrainians. Now, this is important in and of itself, but it's also important when we're trying to get straight what the difference or the similarities are between Ukraine and Russia. I happen to think that this is now the most important difference between Ukraine and Russia, that Russia has not experienced anything like this. The Russian experience of Ukraine is limited hugely by propaganda and by what soldiers say when they come back, if they come back, right? Several thousand Russians have already been killed in action in Ukraine, as I'm sure you know. But it's limited. It's very much constrained. It hasn't affected the entire country. Whereas in Ukraine, it has affected pretty much the entire country. So when people ask what the difference between Ukraine and Russia is, very often we talk about concepts which I think are rather silly, like ethnicity and language. These things don't really, either they don't exist or they don't matter, right? Language does not determine national identity. If it did, then I could just be Canadian and have better health insurance, right? The world doesn't work that way. And ethnicity is a very fluid and questionable concept. What matters is political experience and political commitment. And in Russia and Ukraine, in this way, are more different, right, than pretty much any other pair of European countries you could care to name. Okay, so thank you. So what has actually happened then in the last few months that is so important that I'm stressing it so much? Let me give you a brief sense of why I think the revolution in Ukraine, or the experience on the Maidan in Kiev was so important. The form of politics that has been dominant in Ukraine for basically the entire time Ukraine exists is something that you would call oligarchical pluralism, right? There are a clan of people in Ukraine who, when you're in conversation with them, you don't call them oligarchs, but like when you're safely away in Prague, you might, even though this is being recorded. And that enforces a certain kind of pluralism because each clan has not only their own businesses and their own political interests, they often have their own intellectual agendas, right, including historical memory agendas. So there's a certain kind of pluralism in the Ukrainian discussion. The problem with oligarchical pluralism, I realize it sounds great, and you're thinking, wait, where's our oligarchical pluralist candidate? I have an answer for you to that question. The problem with oligarchy is the rule of law, right? Because when clans have divided everything amongst themselves and the entire system is corrupt, then no one has an interest in the rule of law. And if you're a small or medium-sized businessman or just somebody who wants a fair deal in general, you hit a ceiling very quickly, right? And that is what the Maidan was all about. I mean, the Maidan was basically a middle class. It was a revolution of the Russian-speaking Kievan middle class, right? Above all, the Russian-speaking Kievan middle class against oligarchy. Okay, there were a lot of Ukrainian speakers as well, but the essence of it and where it began, and the language which was most often spoken, just by the way, ethnicity doesn't matter, Russian language doesn't matter, that's all a myth, was Russian. Okay, but so it was about Europe. Now, why was it about Europe? You've gotten used to Europe, you've grown up in Europe, you take it for granted, right? So you can just sleep for the next 5 minutes. But the reason why Europe was significant for the Czech Republic, as for Slovakia too, not so long ago, is the reason why it's significant for Ukraine today. And that is the rule of law, right? If your main problem is you don't have the rule of law, you associate the European Union with the rule of law. Right? So it's a classical sort of middle-class aspiration. If the rules can somehow be imposed, then we'll all do better, our children will do better, and so on. So Europe, the reason why people were willing to go out on the streets for Europe in Ukraine in late November 2013 was not that they love Brussels so much or that they've memorized the acquis communautaire. It is that Brussels is nice, actually. It wasn't meant to be a loud line. It is that for them, Europe symbolized a fair deal, the rule of law, a social contract, something that they have trouble getting in their own country, right? So the meaning of the revolution was anti-oligarchical. The meaning of it was, I think, fundamentally bourgeois. It turned when violence was used. And again, this should resonate in Czechoslovak history. The revolution turned when violence ruled. As you will all remember, the Slovak version of Charter 77 was called the Public Against Violence. Beating students on the 30th of November 2013 really upset people, right? Beating student use of violence by the regime upset people and moved the public towards revolution. The first death was very upsetting. One death in early 2014 changed public opinion dramatically, right? Which is, now we're thousands of deaths later. So it's worth remembering that one death to your normal inhabitant of Kiev seemed like something unacceptable at the time, right? Which is worth remembering when we think about concepts of civil society and decency, right? So the revolution turned in January and February of 2014. The ways in which it had to do with civil society, why I think the Maidan has something to do with civil society, you've already grasped the obvious one, that it's people acting somewhere between their own individual interests and the state. But there are some more interesting levels which I think are worth contemplating. The first has to do with predictability. Right? So if you think about your relationship to the state, I mean, what you generally want, I mean, I realize my anarchist friends are here and they're going to disagree, but what you generally want from the state is predictability. You want the state to follow its own rules. If it doesn't follow its own rules, you generally get upset, right? And one logic of civil society might be this. If the state is not predictable, then society has the right not to be predictable as well, right? That there's a deal on both sides. This is written into the American Declaration of Independence, by the way, which is probably why I think of it. But the society has a right to be unpredictable when authorities are not predictable. The other thing which is interesting about this, as far as civil society, is the variety of it, right? So people try and continue to try to reduce this event to some kind of ethnic outburst or some nonsense like that. But of course, as many of you will know, it was started by a young journalist of Afghan origin, right, whose parents were Muslim. The first person killed was a Belarusian, right? The second was an Armenian. During the mass shootings of February, a Russian was killed, many Jews were killed, a Pole was killed. Why am I mentioning all these people who aren't Ukrainian by ethnicity? Because Ukraine is a multi-ethnic country and because the Maidan was a multi-ethnic event. It didn't have anything to do with ethnicity. In that sense, it's civil society because it was a political choice taken with individual existential risk, right? So past a certain point, anyone who went out there knew that they might die, right? And they were choosing to take that risk as individuals, not as, ethnic Ukrainians or ethnic Russians or ethnic Poles or ethnic Jews. They were choosing to take that risk as part of this political movement and as individuals. That's my understanding. So what did this lead to? Well, at the simplest level, it led to some very predictable things. The government was overturned, there were parliamentary elections, there were presidential elections, there was a new government. That all sounds fine, and it would be fine, except for the other thing that it led to, which was a progressive Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, from the point of view of civil society, this might seem like a more complicated subject, and it is. But it's extremely interesting to consider this war, not just as a war, but as a conflict which I think has quite specifically civil society as its target, right? In other words, when we think of this as a Russian-Ukrainian war, if we think of it at all, which I fear many of us don't, but if we think of it as a Russian-Ukrainian war, I think we're limiting the scales. I think we're limiting the stakes. I think the stakes are much bigger than that. The stakes have much to do with political thought and with models of society and what kinds of society are acceptable. Okay, let me try to defend that. It seems to me that, so the first thing we have to know is that the Ukrainian model of politics, this oligarchical pluralism, did not prevail in Russia. In Russia, there prevailed a presidential centralist model in which there are oligarchs, but for the most part, they make up one clique, which is underneath the president. So you're in a very different kind. You're in a very different kind of political system. From the point of view of that political system, oligarchy in Ukraine is okay, provided your own oligarch is in charge. Right? Because oligarchs in general, again, I'm going to get in trouble, right? But oligarchs in general are not incredibly adventurous people in foreign policy. So if you have the right oligarch in charge, as I would submit, Viktor Yanukovych was, if you have the right oligarch in charge, then from a Russian point of view, you're relatively okay. Oligarchical pluralism is okay for you, provided the right people are in charge. A rebellion against oligarchical pluralism is a kind of double threat. Because on the one hand, and this is how it was experienced in Moscow. On the one hand, you might lose your oligarch, which is which is inconvenient. You spend so much time, like he's not good company. His Russian isn't that good. You spend all this time cultivating him, right? Putin doesn't personally like him, and yet you've like spent all this time with him, and so it's inconvenient to lose your oligarch. But the other reason why it's objectionable is the civil society business, right? Because civil society could be turned against oligarchical pluralism, but civil society could also be turned against presidential centralism. And Kiev is a very bad place for civil society to break out because, as I've already emphasized, it's a post-Soviet country which has lots of things in common with Russia, one of which is that Russian is the dominant spoken language, right? So it's a troubling place for civil society to break out, hence part of the Russian reaction. But the key element of the Russian reaction, which I think is sometimes overlooked, has to do with Europe. So I don't know how many of you, took the great pleasure that I took in following Russian television in the weeks before and during the Maidan. And I stress the before because the direction that Russian television took before the Maidan, as well as during the Maidan, was strikingly anti-European. Something happened in Russian foreign policy, something clicked in Russian foreign policy somewhere in the late summer, the early fall of 2013, coinciding with the formation of this entity called the Eurasian Union, which was meant to be a rival of the European Union. And with that came the campaign, which I hope you're familiar with, of Europeans as decadent, right? And which means that Russia has actually preserved European civilization, whereas all Europeans are basically gay latte drinkers, right? Which, admittedly, sorry, I just had an American moment, right? So the key word in this, and the frightening word in this, the key word in all of this is decadence, right? Because when you say decadence, you might just think, a fat Roman emperor reclining and being fed grapes in some 17th century painting. But what decadence actually means is you're coming to an end. Decadence means decay, right? It means disintegration, it means the end, right? So the Maidan happened at a time when Russian propaganda and even Russian foreign policy began to talk about the end of Europe, or the destruction of Europe, the self-destruction of Europe. And then, interestingly, the propaganda about the Maidan was largely about Europe, right? It was about Swedish pedophilia and Polish imperialism, the Swedish-Polish, renewing the 17th century Great Northern War. It was about Europe. It was about nefarious Europe. It wasn't so much about Ukraine at first. It was mostly about Europe. So the Maidan at first was called the Euromaidan, right? The Euromaidan. And then the Russian version of that, which is sort of untranslatable, was, I'll just say it in English, the gay Euromaidan. Like the idea was that it was all gay. And then there was also the idea that it was fascist, and then it was both gay and fascist, which is interesting. Okay, if this is new to you, you were not watching enough Russian television. Anyway, but the point is that it was the Maidan. We think of the Maidan as a Russian-Ukrainian clash, but I think that really misses the point. It took place at a time when Russia was tilting against Europe, and I think everything that happens vis-a-vis Ukraine has to be understood in the larger European context. And I think Europeans, and by this I mean you as well, are missing the point when you think of it as a Russian-European conflict, because it's not. It's a test case, or it's part of a larger Russian-European conflict, which has something to do with civil society, as I hope we'll have a chance to explain. Okay, so what is so interesting about this war with respect to civil society? What's interesting about this war is the way that it has been fought. I'm just going to very quickly characterize three things about this war, which I think are interesting, and from the point of view of Russian tactics, very intelligent, very, very effective, but certainly worth noting. Worth respecting, right? Worth respecting for their effectiveness, worth appreciating, and worth noting. The first tactic that is something I would call, reverse asymmetrical warfare. So asymmetrical warfare, guerrilla warfare, partisan warfare is what you do when you're weak, right? You don't put insignia on your uniforms, you mix in with the civilians, You try to bring down retaliations on civilian populations on purpose because then they will join you, right? That those partisan techniques. Interestingly, that's how the Russian army has fought this war, right? No insignia on the uniforms, mixing in with civilian population, deliberately drawing fire on Donetsk, Luhansk, now Mariupol, in order to get the civilians upset at the Ukrainian government. So normally you do this when you're weak, right? Russia is doing this even though it's strong. I mean, compared to Ukraine, it's very strong. And one of the things which is interesting about all this, well, I mean, it allows them to deny they're fighting a war. It allows us to say, oh, yes, you're not fighting a war, right, if you want to. But the other thing which is interesting about this is that, in a certain way, it's consistent with the Russian view of what's going on. Because the Russian view of what's going on, I'm going to talk more about this, is that Ukraine doesn't really exist. It's just a projection, of some kind of American conspiracy. And if you believe that, then Russia is in the weaker position, and it's perfectly legitimate for Russia to break all the laws of war, right? Because they are partisans. They're fighting this great American world conspiracy, so of course they should break all the rules, because they're the weak party, right? And this is how they've played it. And a lot of people, interestingly, believe this, that Russia is somehow like in the subaltern position because they're facing off against the great American hegemon. When in fact they're facing off against the Ukrainian army, which, with all due respect, is a very different thing. Okay. The second thing which is interesting about the Russian approach, which is worth noting and respecting and appreciating, is at the level of strategy. And I guess I've already hinted at it. They're pursuing something which I would call strategic relativism. This isn't the name of their doctrine. I'm hoping that they'll plagiarize it for me because I think it's true. Strategic relativism, when you recognize the objective limits of your own power. And there are objective limits to Russian power: technological, demographic, economic, dependence on hydrocarbon exports. When you recognize the limits of your own power, how do you be strong? How do you become strong? You become strong by weakening other people, right? And how do you weaken other people? Well, by making them fall apart. So the reason that Russia is so weak compared to Europe is, I hate to sound like a propagandist for Brussels, but the reason that it's so weak compared to Europe is that Europe is united, right? Russia, compared to any one European state, is actually quite strong for various reasons. Even Germany, it has certain advantages. But compared to the European Union, it's a tiny economy, right? Exports at the level of the Netherlands, whole GDP about the size of France. It's a small country compared to the whole EU. The whole EU, by the way, has a common energy policy and will probably continue to develop a common energy policy so long as it exists. Individual nation states, it's not so clear. And that's very important for Russia because Russia is dependent upon hydrocarbon exports precisely to Europe. So naturally, the way you fight the European Union is that you try to make it fall apart, right? Hence, you talk about its decadence, right? Hence, your propaganda line is that it's falling apart by itself. But what you actually do is you try to make it fall apart. And I would submit that at the same time that Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine, against Ukrainian armed forces, it is carrying out tactics or carrying out policies which are meant to weaken the European Union. The most obvious of these is the support of the European far right. Right? If any of you who still are thinking of Russia as an anti-fascist country would do well to check to see who Russia invited to observe the referendum in Crimea. And the referenda in Donbass and Luhansk, because these were largely fascists, occasional populists, occasional members of respectable political parties who I'm sure just got on the wrong plane by accident from this country. But in general, they were neo-fascists, right? A few members of the extreme left, if you consider Die Linke the extreme left. But in general, they were neo-fascists, right? And this is part of a larger general trend in which President Putin has more or less openly proclaimed himself the leader of the European populist and far right. Why does he do this? Does he have convictions of this kind? I doubt it. He does this because the populist right and the far right have something in common with him, which is that they want to bring it into the European Union, right? So hence you have these very strange utterances by the Front National in France, or even UKIP in Great Britain, right? Where it turns out that Putin is a much admired figure. And so you wonder, how exactly can you be a French or an English nationalist, if what you're doing is executing Russian foreign policy? Rhetorical question. But it seems like, if you're going to be a real nationalist, be a nationalist, right? If you're going to do it, do it. Don't say, oh yes, let's wait for the Russian line and be a nationalist, for crying out loud. Okay, so, but anyway, there's a serious point here, which is that Russia is supporting populism, nationalism, separatism against the European Union, right? So you remember the Scottish referendum? Did you notice that Russia filed an official protest claiming that the referendum actually passed, right? They're in favor of separatism. They want things to fall apart. When Russia launched its second big commercial channel in the US, which is called Sputnik, it launched it under the fanfare of 2015, the year of separatism, right? You know, which maybe it will be, but it seems like there's a certain agenda there, right? Okay, so the highest level, and this moves us closer to civil society, so one more thing about making things fall apart. So they're trying to make the European Union fall apart, and obviously they're trying to make the Ukrainian state fall apart, right? I mean, this war to bleed Ukraine dry is a war to weaken the Ukrainian state. And the irony of it, I mean, as I pointed out a year ago, is that when I predicted that Russia would invade Ukraine, and everyone thought I was crazy, the irony of it is that it's harder than Russia thinks to invade Ukraine, right? Because whatever you think about the Ukrainian state, it does exist. Whatever you think about the Ukrainian nation, it does exist, right? So there is more resistance than they were expecting, and because there's more resistance than they were expecting, they have to keep fighting. And the longer they fight, the longer Russia fights, the more this war disproves their own assumptions about why they're fighting it, and the more it puts the regime that started the war into a corner. But in any event, they're trying to make the European Union fall apart, the Ukrainian state. And this brings us to civil society, right? Civil society is one of the things that you're trying to make fall apart. Okay, I'll return to that. The next level, and maybe the intellectually most interesting level, and again, like the thing which I think requires the most like serious attention and respect, is the philosophy. Basically the applied postmodernism of the philosophy. So the way that Russian organs of propaganda present the war is extremely interesting, right? It's much more sophisticated, than like the silly Western propaganda networks. It's much more sophisticated even than the Germans in the 1930s, and that's a claim that I make after some hesitation. They do a couple of things which fit into our postmodern moment and therefore work on us. And the reason they work on us, of course, is that we are like Russians, and Russians are like us. We're not really that different. Okay, we're very much in the same historical moment. So what they do, one of the things they do is cacophony. So many voices at the same time, right? So if you want to know like who downed, MH17, the Malaysian air flight, it was a Russian brigade based in Kursk. It's not actually that tricky, but the way you make it tricky is you have a talk show and you invite someone in and they say, well, it was a Ukrainian fighter jet. And then you invite someone else in and they say, well, it was the Americans. And you invite someone else in and they say, the Malaysian air flight that went down in Ukraine was actually the same flight as disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. And it was already filled with corpses by the CIA before it was launched. No, that was reported. You're not paying enough attention to the Russian press. There are important things you don't know. So you report all these different versions, and among them you report the version that maybe the separatists shot it down, which is not actually true. That it was the Russian armed forces. But you report a whole bunch of different versions. And see, now I've basically done I've done Russian television's work because now you're going to go home and you're going to say, hey, Professor Snyder said a Ukrainian fighter jet shot it down, right? Because as soon as or Elvis, it was Elvis. As soon as you loose these versions upon the world, what you do is you create a kind of confusion, right? And that's deliberate. When something happens that's really bad, right? Like that Russian forces or forces backed by Russia, it's now more or less been demonstrated as Russian forces. But if something very bad happens, you don't deny it, right? You don't stand up and say, no, it wasn't us. You let loose a whole lot of other versions, and then at the end of the day, no one's really sure. And that's all you have to aim for. That no one's really sure. The second thing, which is they've done amazingly well, is political marketing. Okay, which I admit it, they learned this from us. RT is just like Fox News on speed, and the political marketing often came from Americans. Okay, like guilty, but they do it very well. Okay, so what are the two forms of political marketing? The first is you play to the conservative right, and the way that the Russians play the conservative right is this whole story about decadence. Decadence, family values, conservative values, true Christian civilization, right? Which are supposedly safeguarded by Russia, even though if you look at like out of wedlock births and abortion rates and any like actual empirical data, Russia is not exactly, much as I like the place, it's not exactly the place for conservative values in practice. I mean, even by Czech standards. Okay, it's not. Speaking of another place where people talk about conservative family values, you just have to sort of shake your head. So to the right, they have this story, right? Conservative values, civilizations, and then for the left, they have another story. The story for the left is the Ukrainians are fascists. They're all fascists. Bandera, 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 bandera. Right? And by the way, they're all fascists. And that's for the left, right? And obviously, the two stories are contradictory, but they target them, and it works very well. And so you get these weird coalitions of people who think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is okay. People who presumably wouldn't agree with each other on other things. So the political marketing is the second part of the effective postmodernism of all this. Now, where does this leave us with respect to civil society? What I've tried to do is give you a sense of how Ukraine and Russia are alike and different, both of which are really important. What happened on the Maidan, what that had to do with civil society, and what the Russian reaction to Maidan has to do with civil society, which I think is rather a lot. Let me try to be clear now in a kind of conceptual way about what it means. So the three big conclusions. The first is the civil society. I think, I mean, there are people here who have thought about this much more than me, but I think one of the important aspects of civil society is the self-emancipation part, right? The part where you decide who you are, right? The part where you say, even though the state is like this, and even though all my friends are doing this other thing, I'm going to do what I decide to do. The sort of self-emancipatory, the self-defining part, right? And then as you do that, maybe you meet other people and you play in a rock band, or you meet other people and you brew beer, or whatever it might be. But it's that choice to do your own thing. Now, this I think is very serious because it runs up against, in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, it runs up against some of the arguments that have been made on the Russian side, which strike me as worth thinking about really seriously. If you say, right, that there is a Ruski mir, that there's a world of Russian civilization, and in some way everyone who speaks Russian, or who even pronounces the phrase Ruski mir, that everyone who does this somehow belongs to civilization, whether they know it or not, right? Okay, that's like a nice argument to have in a cafe. Is there a Ruski mir? Is there not Ruski mir? But it actually has serious political, and I would even say existential implications. Because if I can say, right, I believe in Ruski mir, and then I can look out at you and say, whoever speaks Russian out there, oh, yeah, you belong to the civilization too. I'm taking away your right to define who you are, right? The argument is even clearer in the case of Novorossiya, right? Where Putin has argued that part of Ukraine is historically part of the Russian Empire, therefore those people are Russian, therefore they should be in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. These are ethnic arguments, and here we see the difference between ethnicity and civic identification, which is really, really, really important, right? It's not just something that you learn like the first semester of your ethnic, of your transition course or whatever. It's really, really, it's a fundamental difference. Because if I'm allowed to say that this is New Russia and these people are Russians because they speak Russian, then I am taking away their right to define who they are, right? I mean, if I'm allowed to look at Canada and say, well, those people speak English, therefore they're American, why don't we just sort of roll on in? I'm making an ethnic argument. And you see how absurd it is on that example, right? And it's absurd on any example. There's a difference between civic and ethnic identity. And the difference is that ethnic identity allows power claims from far away. Right? And this is an example which every Czech should by now have recognized because it is the example of 1938. If I say that there's Novorossiya, I'm making exactly the same move as if I said there was Sudetenland. By the way, Sudetenland did not exist until Hitler invented it, right? You probably think it existed, but it didn't. Sudetenland was an invented region drawn out on the map to include the Skoda works, for example, right? It was drawn on a map to include the things the Germans wanted. It was an invented category, just like Novorossiya is an invented category, based upon an ethnic argument, right? So these are the things which break up states, which brings me to the next point that I want to make. The second conceptual conclusion, it's about the state. So it seems to me that civil society is about the relationship between the individual and the state. And the one thing that we can be sure about The minimal claim on behalf of civil society is that this is a relationship that we get to negotiate, right? That the state doesn't decide what it's all about, any more than the individual decides what it's all about. But the other thing that we can say about the individual and the state as we contemplate this particular situation that we have is that if there is no state, there isn't going to be civil society, right? If you, I don't know how many of you have been spending much time in Ukraine now. I mean, it's certainly the case that there's really interesting civil society activity going on. If the people who are helping the refugees from Donetsk and Crimea and so on are usually small people working in small organizations. That said, in the places where state structures have been wiped out, like in the Donbass, I'm afraid that you can't really speak of civil society there. I mean, so let me put it a different way. In the 1990s, Americans had a certain fantastic and sense of fantasy, reading of Václav Havel, which I'm afraid Václav Havel also shared, which was that, or at least he allowed himself to sort of be co-opted by us. And that was, if you believe the civil society thing, what you're really saying is no state is good. States are bad, no states are good. And that way, Havel got swept into our neoliberal whirlwind. And that, that, my friends, is clearly wrong. If there is no state, things go very bad very quickly, and then it's impossible to speak of civil society, right? And so when Russia manages to wipe out state structures in Donetsk and Luhansk, which it does, it is also destroying civil society. Because when gangsters of various kinds are running the streets, there's not civil society. A state can destroy civil society by being too strong. It can also destroy civil society by wiping out someone else's state structures, which is, another lesson here which is worth remembering. Civil society is a negotiation between individuals and states, which means you have to have individuals, but you also have to have states. The third and final remark that I want to make here is about trust. And this may be the question which bears most directly on the civil society tradition and on the way that the Maidan was carried out and on the Russian war. If you decide who you're going to be, especially in authoritarian conditions, and you do something with someone else, you're trusting them, right? There's a certain, there's what we would now call an offline technology here, right? There is human trust involved. There's the belief that the other person is not going to turn you into the authorities. There's the belief that he or she sincerely is interested in the same things that you're interested in, right? Civil society, at the smallest and most important level, kind of depends upon that. It depends upon trust. The Maidan obviously depended upon trust in this way, right? The people who I know who were on the Maidan have what they call their Maidan friends. That is, people who they met in that particular situation, to whom they would literally trust their lives and well-being in a moment of crisis, right? And these were very often friends that they didn't have before, people from different social milieu, people who they would not have met without that particular situation, right? That's a radical example of trust. Now, let's think about the last thing that I said about the Russian war, this postmodernism, the cacophony, the political marketing, right? Which we all have to sort of grow up and learn to deal with and resist. The ultimate point of these things is not to make you believe any particular version of the truth. That's not the point. That's very old-fashioned, right? That's so 20th century. That's done, right? No one is trying to make you believe in the final triumph of communism or fascism, as the case may be. No one is trying to make you believe in the final triumph of anything at this point. What people are trying to do is corrode your capacity to believe in anything, right? What Russian propaganda is doing is exporting Russian distrust in the media and the authorities to the rest of the world, right? So the Russians don't believe in their media, they don't believe their authorities, right? They shouldn't. We shouldn't either in general, but but what's corrosive and ultimately toxic is the presumptive belief that everything which comes in from the media is part of some kind of scam, right? And that's what all of this is aiming for. It's aiming for the erosion of belief in any kind of authority, or, to be a little bit philosophical about it, in truth, right? If you can't trust anyone to tell you the truth, if you really believe that what happened, for example, on the Maidan, was not a lot of people who trusted each other in a life or death situation, but a CIA plot, which was somehow organized at long distance. If you really believe that's what happened, then you don't believe in trust, or you don't believe that it matters, right? And once you've made that move, You're in the world of conspiracy theories, where everything happens at long distance. It's all part of some design by unseen forces, whatever they might be, gay fascist, Jewish gay fascist, whatever they turn out to be. No, I mean, there are, that's a good example of political marketing, right? There's a Russian version which says that Ukrainians are all anti-Semitic, and there's also a version which says that Ukraine itself is a Jewish plot, right? Depending upon who you're aiming for, both versions are out there. So if you can't trust, this is really important. It has to do with like this whole distinction between the offline world and the online world. If you can't trust anyone because you don't believe in truth, or you don't believe in truth, therefore, how could you trust anyone? Because there's no truth anyway. That means that everyone is just somehow a puppet of some conspiracy or another. Then civil society is impossible, right? And this seems to be the ultimate thing which is at stake. And it's interesting. I mean, I think it gives us a reason to think about civil society again, and it's important. I think it's the most important thing which is happening. I think it's more important in Ukraine. I think it's more important even than Europe. This question about how politics actually functions. Does politics happen because people between the level of the state and the individual are able to trust each other enough to form organizations? Or does politics happen because civil society has ceases to exist? Which is the very last thing I want to say. The thing about civil society, like so many things, it does exist in the world. I mean, it is out there. But if you choose not to believe in it, you can make it go away. Like so many things, it does exist. So, anyone who tells you it doesn't exist is a little bit too cynical, or they have a purpose in saying so. But if you take the view that it doesn't exist, you can make it go away. You can break down trust. It can be done. It has been done before. It's been done in this part of the world before, and not so terribly long ago. Okay, thank you very much.